my revolutionary greetings in that manner. Too many nights I've cried.
ENingizimu Afrika yangemuva kwentando yeningi, ababhali bemidlalo yenkathi emisha basaluzwa ubizo lokuphendula ezindabeni zomphakathi esibhekene nazo. Kodwa ingabe ubuciko bethiyetha yembhikisho buseyindlela efanele nenomthelela yokuxhumana nabantu baseNingizimu Afrika? INingizimu Afrika yaziwa ngomlando wayo onothile wemidlalo yembhikisho nokwenza imidlalo yeshashalazi. Eminyakeni eyaholela ekukhululweni kukaNelson Mandela kanye nokhetho lwethu lokuqala wentando yeningi, amaciko aseNingizimu Afrika adlala indima enkulu emzabalazweni wenkululeko. Elinye lamagalelo anomthelela omkhulu kwakuyithiyetha. Ababhali bemidlalo bangaleso sikhathi sikwazile ukuhlanganisa ukuthungatheka kanye nolwazi lweningi olwalulwela iNingizimu Afrika enobulungiswa nokhululekile.
Most of us, we know that a majority of the contemporary theatre makers like myself, we were very much influenced by protest theatre or theatre of activism. And for me, it's the fact that as much as, you know, way back in around the 70s and the 80s, when it was very prominent and very relevant for a number of theatre makers, practitioners, thespians to write works that speak and that take a strong stand against apartheid, you know, and racism and prejudice within South African political landscape. It was very imperative. It was very important. That's what, you know, theatre is the mirror. Theatre reflects what's happening currently. It reflects the different dynamics within our communities, our societies, but overall, you know, landscape of human nature, right? Is it still relevant? I think it's still relevant. And as much as in the current form, you ever hardly, you know, deal with works that speak against the system, but I think it's just by nature theatre's role and tool is to question, to provoke thought, to bring to the forefront. So as much as we are not writing about apartheid or about racism, we still are writing about Fees Must Fall, right? We're still writing about Marikana, right? The massacre. We are still writing and speaking to gender-based violence, #MeToo. And when you look at our other counterparts and other theatre makers from African-American perspective across the United States, they write about Black Lives Matter. And there's very close nuances that compares, that allow us to compare, you know, the level of racism that's happening in the States with racism that still happens here. Yes, by books, by constitution, in writing, South Africa is a democratic country, but we know for a fact that racism is still one of the biggest inequalities that really are on the forefront of, you know, prejudice and really violation of human rights. I mean, when you look at, you know, the current shutdowns that are happening around the country, you know, it's the role of a theatre maker to reflect that. Otherwise, you'll be telling lies. But even beyond that, like I said, gender-based violence, femicide, South Africa, you know, is the kingdom of femicide. So as much as it's not the kind of works that comes out of that are not protest, they are theatre of activism. And for me, it's another form of taking a stand and really really challenging the status quo when it comes to gender-based violence and inequalities and the realities of a majority of women. And also, you know, our counterparts within the queer community, you know, corrective rape, all those dynamics, you know, they really speak to theatre of activism or of resistance.
In the 70s, in the 60s, we can call it the decade of silence because there was so much oppression. But actually, Athol Fugard was writing and others were beginning to imagine what it was like to create a theatre of struggle, a protest theatre. And by the late 60s, the Black Consciousness movement, led by Stephen Bantu Biko and others, became a very vital component in the argument about what culture should be doing. And actually, the Black consciousness movement placed culture on the agenda firmly. African drums, African flute, poetry, and poetry in classrooms and in trade union halls and so on played a major part in the conscientization of a generation.
The protest theatre to work in the past was because it was the relevance of the apartheid and the systems that the theatre then was fighting against. So what it makes it irrelevant today is because of the systems that we have now need a different approach when it comes to protest theatre. So most of us, we go back to how the protest theatre has been executed in the past for the reasons of the past. And we try to use what worked in the past in different situations, in different scenario and fights altogether. So for me, we need to redefine it for ourselves as a current generation, as the generation of 2023. How then do we create a theater that is going to be guiding, to fight the systems that we have, systems that we are in? So for me, it is relevant if it's written properly, but if we're going to use plays that are from the past, that fought the system in the past, it's not going to work, because things that they fought for, they've won, they've achieved what they wanted to achieve with the protest theatre then. So we need a new narrative when it comes to protest, so that we could also fight and win what we want to win. In the past, theatre was accessible. Remember, these plays that were made by the protest theatre in the past used to perform in community halls, stadiums, schools, and whatnot. But in our generation, we want to subject theatre into a theatre building. So there's no much access to it. Even if we would write a protest theatre piece now that deals with now, it's going to be seen in a theatre. And theatre, there's a culture on theatre that is accessed by certain individual work that concerns the people, that fights the systems, current systems. So we are doing the current protest theatre, but we're doing it in a community theatre spaces, community hall, that we converted it into a professional theatre space. So it's still impactful, but if we could look also, who are we sending the message to? Who do we want to invite in the fight of whatever that we're fighting for? If we're fighting load shedding, who needs to be part of that fight? We need also to find ways how to access them and use the theatre in a very productive and in a way that is going to reach where it needs to reach. So yes, it is still impactful. The difference is we are performing it for ourselves and our peers. We're creating the same work. We need to open it up and take it back to the people. Then we'll begin to realize or to see the impact it has.
The question on the table is, what role did theatre play in the times of struggle? And is the word protest theatre an accurate word to describe what was going on? We can pause that question and move back in time to the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And a very important play was written by Athol Fugard right at the beginning of the 60s, called The Blood Knot. And my view is that that set out the terrain for all our conversation in the world of theatre in South Africa for the next 30 years. And that was that the fundamental thing that ties us together, whether we're black or white or whoever we are, is the blood knot. It is a complicated connection that we all have, whether we like it or not. And it is a struggle. It is a struggle for identity. It's a struggle for clarity. And of course, it was the beginning of a struggle for democracy. Since the 50s, the African National Congress in particular had intensified the idea of a proper struggle for freedom. And when Sharpeville happened in 1960, it was clear that the only solution was to move underground after the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress were banned. The Communist Party banned some 10 years before. And the idea was there would be a struggle for freedom in this country. And every part of civil society would play a part should they so wish. And I started my theatre life in the early 70s at Wits University And there were a couple of things there that were so important to me. One was the idea of a new kind of thinking about history. There was the history workshop emerging, and basically there was an idea that we had to understand history from below. We had to understand that we could create a new kind of narrative for our country in the struggle for freedom. And although theatre could be said to play a small part in that, it played a role that became very significant, especially by the time the Market Theatre opened in '76, and the Space Theatre in Cape Town some years before that. In other words, an independent theatre movement that was committed to, I suppose, speaking truth to power, although it wasn't called that in those days. As Barney Simon would say, we just bear witness. As Ethel Fugard says, we just bear witness. We simply see what is going on around us. We have all the material we need to make powerful, progressive theatre.
Get inside and fire shots from it so that the police can find cartridges inside.
Shoot up. This looks like a total onslaught.
I think there's a big need for a protest theatre in our country, especially South Africa, because it seems as if, depending on it's an opinion again, it seems as if there are a lot of issues that are still unresolved. Like there's a lot of things that are going on that people, or rather should I say, abanye abantu, they really don't agree with some certain things that are happening within the country. So that's where I think a protest theatre comes in my own opinion.
My own involvement started in the early '70s, and as I say, there were a couple of key ideas that were on the agenda. The one idea was that we could create history as we understand it from a progressive point of view. And if we were involved in theatre, we could create plays that dealt with that history. And the ambition was to create theatre for the majority. And a group like Workshop 71 put some of this very firmly on the agenda. How do we make theatre for the majority, which was, although it wasn't named as such, it was a non-racial idea, because majority did not imply only Black. It meant majority point of view for the majority of the country, i.e. Black. But there was still space for other voices to be heard. And that gave me courage and me understanding of what was possible, or at least began to understand what was possible, as I moved towards creating Junction Avenue Theatre Company in the middle '70s. We started work on a project called, which became known as The Fantastical History of a Useless Man. And the idea there was that we were going to give expression to the implicit violence that we were experiencing in the early '70s all the way to 1976, when we started working in June. And in early '76, sorry. And when June, of course, came around and the uprising started in Soweto, we were faced with a dilemma that we were faced many, many times. Does theatre have a role? Can we make plays that still have a space when the struggle and the performance, because there were elements of performance in all of this, was in the streets? And we decided to continue and let history be the judge. So we made Fantastical History of a Useless Man, which tells the story of a white activist born around the time of the early, 1950, comes to consciousness in 1960 when he hears about Sharpeville and tries to understand what that means. And then when he gets to the university, in our narrative version, he starts engaging in political acts that are progressive. Finally, he is offered an AK-47 and asked, what can you really do? And he doesn't take it. And he decides that he is a useless man. Of course, making the play was not useless, and making the play with such enormous success, which it had, was not useless. But it was a debate. Do we join the struggle and go underground and join MK? Or can we still have a place in civil society, whether we educate, whether we make plays, whether we engage in journalism and so on? And I suppose you could say that although the space for progressive newspapers such as the then Mail and Guardian, the space for theatre in small venues, because the state only allowed certain plays to play in small venues, was there a space for this? I'm arguing yes, because it was part of the larger conversation that was changing the narrative and preparing people for the struggle to bring about democracy, non-racialism, and anti-sexism, and so on. And if we think of theatre as a minor part of the very large conversation, then there is a space for it.
There is still a strong urgency for theatre to always be the tool that stands and speak back to power. But I don't think any theatre maker, when they write work, they are saying they're speaking back to power. The first premise of any theatre maker is to reflect reality and tell the truth as it is. And now this truth might not be good, but this truth can be extremely humorous, right? This truth can come through a song. This truth can come through a poem. This truth can come through mime, silence, where the body is speaking, just like dance, right? But there's still agency. And it's not the agency that I think we even have to get to a point where we're still asking if it's relevant. By nature, theatre is agent, is immediate. It has been part of our traditional traditions and traditional performances from, far back in, through our great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers. Storytelling is part of our day-to-day life. It's just that we have different forms and formats now, digital spaces, and as opposed to just live performances. But it will always be agent. It will always be a sense of emergency and relevance and point of reflections and point of, departure for us.
Most important South African plays, based on the conviction that arts and culture can change the socio-political context. So the unmistakable leader in this field is undeniably Athol Fugard. Widely regarded as South Africa's greatest playwright and arguably the creator of the first real airing of protest theatre, he is best known for his political and penetrating plays such as The Island, Sizwe Banzi is Dead, Master Harold and the Boys, and The Road to Mecca. Fugard is acknowledged as taking the prize for achieving the protest aspect as well as enduring and watchable plays. The Servant Players group were groundbreaking too, in that the color bar was flaunted at the same time as the subject matter. Peter Dergace, in his inimitable fashion, made his mark in the 80s with shows like Rearranging the Deck Chairs on the SA Titanic. But he actually shot to major fame when he adopted his alter ego, Evita Besadenhout. And Ace cleverly managed to switch the focus of his satire to the ruling party. Beautifully costumed and elegant, Evita made people think and laugh at political send-ups, subjects they'd never considered before. And the girls in their Sunday dresses made Zakes Mda an important protest voice. Freedom, devised by Machimela Matwang, created a bleak landscape where characters stood in line to receive subsidized food that never seemed to arrive. And other important all anti-apartheid plays were Woza Albert, 1980, that was Barney Simon, Mongeni Ngema, Percy Mtwa, Igoli, also 1980, Matsemela Manaka, as well as Sophia Town, You Strike the Woman, You Strike the Rock, and Born in the RSA. Contemporary issues were and still are excellently dealt with by Mike van Graan and John Carney with their Nothing But the Truth. In terms of physical street theatre, Andrew Buckland continues to impress with his physical street theatre, which combines comedy, sophisticated political satire, clowning, mime, and an explosive performance style. Ellis Pearson and Becky Mkwani's Boy Called Rubbish was an important work. It deals with a young orphan's struggles to overcome a domineering mother and the hardship of poverty, and then discovers his real worth and grows to become a hero. And just to mention, moving to today's theatre world, Becky Kwani's son, Menzi, who lives in Durban, is making his talent known as well with some excellent productions.
You know, theater is an immediate way of communicating, and theater would make you reflect, right, on what you're doing right and what you're doing wrong. So for me, theater is an immediate and practical, and that engages all your senses at once while you're watching a theater. So the role of theater is to build, shape, and move the community forward. But now remember, the danger of every community is its own writers. So we as writers, we can write things that are going to damage our communities, or we could decide to write things that are going to build and shape our communities. And theater has that power to build and to destroy, because the feelings you get and how every message you get from theater is communicated becomes immediate, and you engage with it. It's either is going to build or is going to destroy. And for me, theater's role in our community is to build and shape our communities, educate, inform, question, find new designs also around, or build new system for people and test them on stages and see if it's going to work in a practical sense. But for me, theater is to shape, build, and give a clear depiction of the future, the currents of whatever that we have in our communities.
There were many risks, and the risks ranged from minor harassment through to detention, and in one case of significance, a playwright being thrown onto the tracks of a train and dying there. It was interesting. If you made theatre that was somewhat abstract and not directly advancing the interest of the revolutionary parties, you were mostly left alone. But in the case of people who made plays about the struggle for freedom in Mozambique, those playwrights went to jail. And they went to jail, they were found guilty of treason or some such, and they were found guilty because of the plays they made. It wasn't always direct censorship. Certainly television, when it emerged in 76, was highly censored. Films were highly censored. Why? Because they have a large reach. But the way that plays were censored in South Africa was very unusual. In order to get your play on in the townships, you had to get permission from the township manager, who then allowed you to play in a hall or not. And that's how they stopped certain plays from playing in Soweto, for example.
Another interesting aspect over the last couple of years has been the COVID pandemic. While it shut down many theatres and performance venues, it did mean that the creative people were faced with entirely different outlets for their talents. Trapped at home, many writers started creating their own work and placing them online. And so, a new form of creativity was born. Thank heavens for modern technology, if all else fails.
Kule minyaka emibili edlule, izindawo eziningi zeshashalazi ezizimele eNingizimu Afrika kudingeke ukuthi zivalwe ngenxa yobhubhane lwe-COVID-19. Cishe eminyakeni engamakhulu amathathu sibusa ngentando yeningi, futhi sisabhekene nezinhlelo zenkohlakalo kuhulumeni wethu. Izinga lokwantuleka kwemisebenzi linyukile, futhi-ke kusona umongameli walo nyaka uCyril Ramaphosa umemezele isimo esiphuthumayo sikazwelonke samanzi namandla. Ithini indima yomdidiyeli weshashalazi emphakathini wethu, futhi ubani obhala imidlalo ekhuluma ngezindaba zaseNingizimu Afrika entsha?
We are an audience that is changing. You look at technology, it's wearing different kinds of shoes. So times are quite evolving quite fast. But just to track a little bit back, one should understand what was or what is protest theatre and what was the aim for it. And with that, you look at how, as I said, things are changing, and you look at where we are as artists, as playwrights mainly, and there is one thing that is not changing, is the urgency of wanting change. It's the urgency of wanting a better life. It's the urgency of feeling like whatever's happening around you, it's not changing. There's nothing happening. It's the agency of wanting solutions. It's the agency of wanting to feel not alone. And I think with protest theater, what it did back then, and what it still has and it keeps on doing, is that it created a community. People who were in that space when there's a production happening, or whether it's someone writing, they knew they were writing for a certain type of people. And the people that were always writing, they wanted to provoke a reaction, wanted some kind of a response, but also to feel less alone. And I think those feelings are so apparent even now. When I think of myself as a playwright, I think that every time I create something, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from because you still seek some kind of reaction. You seek some kind of wanting your own community.
When you're doing art, you don't just wake up and say, no, I want to do a story about this, but the stories come from somewhere, or rather there is a certain thing that's bothering you, and there's something that you want to share or want to, depending on the issue. So now, that is why I think, in my own opinion, protest theater still is impactful. Should be impactful, because again, if we wanted to be impactful, I think we could go back to the issues of, would say, like trying to find an audience for theater. Then we'd go to a different issue of theater itself, because before it can even become impactful, protest theater. For me, in terms of protest theater, because in my own understanding, I think protest theater is about rejecting our structures. You protesting against something. So theater, if you break down the term protest theater, theater is a space whereby stories are being told, and protest means to go against something or reject something, which are things like structures, laws, rules. So when it comes to protest theater, I don't think it's a matter of an audience having an appetite, because it is about the artist trying to protest against something, which is maybe a certain law or a certain rule or something that's bothering.
What is a popular protest theater that you remember and why?
Oh my gosh, popular protest theatre that I remember is easily
Water Albert's a classic.
One in the RSA is I think I'm remembering it around the ensemble.
Suzubanji's death is the first thing that comes to mind. It's about the purchase of passport and also the life of a black man during apartheid.
The reason why I think it partly had to do because it was such a focus in my first year studies, and then getting the opportunity to see it when it was live at the Playhouse in I think the past 2-3 years. It just sort of solidified all the knowledge that I'd learned, and I got to see this work in practice and the power of it.
The fact that it was one of those where it was actors of different races. Of course, we know during apartheid that was not allowed. That in itself was a protest, apart from the content in the script and the narrative.
The fight also that he had to do and endure and live through in order to be seen as a person and be a person. So when you say protest theater, the first thing that comes into my mind is definitely the play. Yeah.
How has your life been transformed by theatre?
Big one. It's a big one.
I mean, the theatre has served as a space for me to really breathe, and obviously get to voice out things that ordinarily I wouldn't.
I think it's been changed in so many ways, both in that like I get to be involved in something that I love, And two, it has changed my life because I'm constantly learning new things. I'm constantly engaging with new individuals, new theories, new ideas.
Theatre is life. Theatre is a mirror of life. Theatre is living through the daily experiences of who we are as individuals, who we are as a society, who we are as a community.
Jacques Lecoq, for example, one of the theatre practitioners and theorists that I use in my own work, he says something along the lines of, like, give a man a mask and he'll tell you the truth.
There's new ways of, confronting injustice in the world, and it's so broad because I feel like with each new experience and each new work I engage with, I'm getting to engage new knowledge. And that in turn changes and involves me as a person.
So how does it influence me in everything that I do, in every aspect of my life? That is the movement, that is the conversation.
The theatre has given me that space to really say my truth, and especially as someone who's really the other in society, being a queer individual.
So I feel like theatre just has such a strong power in my life, regardless of me as an artist, because even as a person, it has a huge involvement in who I am and how I engage in this world.
What issues in our democracy can theatre be used to address?
Issues, there's so many. I can't even pick one. Gender-based violence, women's issues. I know that I just recently have finished my master's dissertation and I was writing about the inscriptions on the Black female body. And that in its own is a protest to be seen as a human being, to fight for equality, to be a person within the society and not just a commodity that doesn't have a voice.
We can't deny that in our democracy, we are living with a legacy of apartheid. We're living with injustice, and we're still living with structural issues that have been implemented in a past that did not serve the people of this country.
So it's fighting for social change, it's fighting for change within our community, it's fighting for change for ourselves.
Theatre, especially protest theatre, is a mechanism to call to action and to change this country and allow us to grow and move forward into the vision that we foresaw for ourselves in 1994. We saw ourselves as a collective, as a union of equally diverse people, and I find that especially protest theatre is rooted in that foundation of change.
South Africa has a lot. So you can't. You can't really give or single out a particular issue, but just in the sense that theatre enables. And it's quite relevant actually to look back at what was how theatre was produced and made back then, because it can inform us moving forward, and we'll know exactly the power that it holds.
Imizwa yokungabi nobulungiswa, isidingo soshintshe kanye nentukuthelo yokungabi nobulungiswa kwasakazeleka emgwaqweni ngaphakathi kwethiyetha. Imibukiso ayizange iphele ngemuva kokuvala ucingo. Lezi zindaba zilethe ukuphuthuma okusha emphakathini nasezimpilweni ebezikhombisa, futhi kwaqala lapho imiqondo yabantu iyaqala ukushintsha. eThekwini, i-The Table Theatre eyasungulwa nguCasey Govender phakathi kwawo ama-70s yaba ishashalazi lokuqala elimnyama eliphethwe lizimele. Ngaleso sikhathi eGoli, i-The Market Theatre yavulwa iminyango yayo yagcina isidume umhlaba wonke ngokuthi i-Theatre of Struggle yaseNingizimu Afrika.
And in my view, although the state theatre and the market theatre and other government-funded institutions have got significant space yet still to play extraordinary pieces of work, and from the state theatre we see extraordinary new musicals about Marikana and about Askaris and so on. Essentially, we need independent spaces, and the reason we need independent spaces, in spite of the fact that these major institutions do good work, is that of the 200 or 300 people who were applying for spaces in the market theatre in my time, when I was the artistic director, we could perhaps do 30 productions a year, maximum. And of those, we could probably fund 6 to 8. The rest were either co-productions or special events or rentals. And what we need small spaces that are independently run, hopefully with money from the National Arts Council and these other institutions, if ever we get any of that right, so that the young voices can get a space. The young voices, whether they be writers, directors, or performers. And I suppose, even in my time, I had to work in independent spaces as a young creator before I got my first chance at a professional performance job, if you like, a commission at the Market Theatre, after some 5 years or more.
Tina hayidlula le danger tape asomblive basebenzi. Phambili nga-12,500 phambili. Phambili nga-12,500 phambili. Qina msebenzi qina. Qina msebenzi qina. Qina msebenzi qina.
For protest theatre. The funding support is necessary, to keep the theatre performances alive. I think we still do need protest theatre. I mean, it has had a significant impact on the socio-political landscape of South Africa, particularly in the post-apartheid era. So, it kind of served as a powerful tool for social justice and activism, and allowed artists and performers to express themselves. So, I mean, it has played a vital role in foregrounding issues that affect our society. So it remains an important outlet also for free expression.
With protest theatre, there was kind of a call and response. There was a continuation of a reaction. As soon as the performance is done, definitely that performance will continue even in the streets, and that is why protest theatre was able to work back then. And now we would watch a piece, and after a show, we applaud and we go back to our normal lives, and then then that's it. Then there's a matter of a lot of artists, a lot of playwrights. They they need a lot of funding, as we know, to create work, to be able to live. But also the systems in place are not in our side. And they're not supporting the work to continue. I would like to see stories being part of our culture as we raise our kids, and theatre allows them to do that. The art of belief, theatre allows them to do that, to create that space that you are able to imagine yourself away from where you are. You are able to escape where you are, and theatre allows us to do that. But also it adds layers of protecting yourself from things that you do not want.
One of the things that we need to acknowledge is that theatre evolves, right? As much as it has been over time been this ancient, tool of storytelling that we all inherited, it has transformed and evolved over time. Now, is it even for us contemporary playwrights key, or even theatre makers key for us to even do protest theatre? I think we cannot even separate ourselves from that, right? And I keep going back to how truthful the theatre is, right? How truthful theatre is. It's the truth, and the truth never changes. It might change in terms of who tells that truth or who pens down that truth, but truth can never change.
when this piece was first premiered at the Market Theatre in Johannesburg, it was directed by Athol Fugard himself. I happened to, I was much younger and I was still performing. I don't perform anymore. I only write and direct. But I was the first Isabel ever. So I was the first character who played the little girl. And when I had the opportunity to revisit that experience as a mature woman, it was an invaluable opportunity for me to go, gosh, I can approach this from a very different angle now because I have so much more knowledge, so much more experience. And the beauty also is that this is a school set work. So kids often, especially teenagers who struggle to concentrate, or all teenagers struggle to concentrate, if they, you know, read the play and it's a very, very long play and it's extremely wordy in its original form, not that that's a bad thing, that's the style of Fugard, or was. If they have the opportunity to see it come alive, it comes off the page and becomes something that is completely different for them. It's a three-dimensional, immersive experience for them. The characters become real people who they become attached to, who they love, who they can identify with. And for me, that was extremely important because the underlying themes in My Children, My Africa are human themes. It's important to stage protest theatre because in the same way as all historical events are important for us to inform ourselves about, that period in South African history was an important period for this generation to learn about. So if you don't stage protest theatre, they have no access, or they do, but you know, they have to go out and look for it themselves. So it's history. And because it's history, and because people need to contextualize where they are today in the South African environment, it's extremely important that they familiarize themselves with the experiences of the generations that came before them.
Theatre did that. When you think about where it was happening, which venue it was happening, and you think about which people were in that space experiencing that protest theatre, it was never people who were against that. It was people who wanted some kind of change, or people who wanted to have a safe space to react to talk about the current issues they were experiencing.
I think post 1994 that theatres still definitely have an urgency with regards to protest theatre. I think what's become apparent is that pre-1994 there was a single clear enemy, so to speak, that people were rallying against, which was of course apartheid. But post 1994, I think a new generation of theatre makers and young people and artists have multiple so-called enemies, where we're fighting capitalism, we're fighting white supremacy, we're fighting homophobia. And obviously these things were all present pre-1994 during apartheid, but without one single clear overarching like major enemy. We've got no more Thanos. So now we've got all these little mini enemies, and it feels like there's no single way to fight or no single enemy. So you feel a little bit scattered and you feel a little bit overwhelmed as an artist, and you're going, oh my gosh, I don't know where to look. I don't know where to turn because there's so much going on in the world. So it's almost like you have to have more intensity and more clarity and more strength in your protest art and in your protest theatre in particular, because because there's so many things that you're tackling and that you're dealing with. And when we made the fall post sort of Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, and not even post, we were sort of in the middle of it as well while we were making it. It felt very apparent that we had to deal with colonialism, we had to deal with homophobia, we had to deal with transphobia, we had to deal with patriarchy, and there were all these little things coming up that it didn't feel like we had one single thing to focus on. So I think in a way that means that protest art is more important and more necessary now. And it means that as artists, you have to have a stronger shield within yourself and within your art to be able to understand all these different things coming at you, and to be able to sift through to be able to sift through the random stuff and get to the heart of the battle that you're trying to fight. And so when we were making the fall, we decided, we have to represent all of our friends and our comrades around us, as well as representing ourselves. And part of it was to offer that counter narrative to the public, but then another part of it was to offer catharsis and healing to our comrades and our fellow activists, and say, we're not crazy, we're not losing our minds. This is what we've all dealt with, and it's been really hectic and really stressful and really traumatizing in a lot of ways. And as artists, we felt like it was our responsibility to hold that mirror up to society, at the time being us in the middle of a protest. And we wanted to make sure that the people around us felt like they were seen and that they were heard, and that their lives and the things that they sacrificed.
The Center for Creative Arts at the University of KwaZulu-Natal is committed to advance the values of the South African Constitution. So we see Section 16, which deals with freedom of expression and freedom of creativity as core parts to which we need to be constantly aware of, and to be able to find pathways through which the artists who work with us are able to express themselves freely without hindrance, but to also use that kind of free expression for robust engagement, but with a clear understanding that free expression and free creativity also comes with a great deal of responsibility and accountability. And that's what we always put forward to artists. You can be expressing yourself freely and creatively, but understand your audience and the repercussions that could come your free expression. Sometimes the repercussions can be positive, sometimes negative, and that as an artist, you need to know how to deal and engage with it, and you need to take responsibility for it. But even as the university, we are obliged to take responsibility for all expressions that are made through any of our festivals.
Well, the State Theatre understands its mandate and its mission as a space for creative expression, be it in the form of productions, theatrical productions. For example, we have just launched recently, about a year and a half ago, conversations with the authors, and that's where we also create space or a platform for people with different points of view or philosophies in life to come and express themselves here or share their ideas. So our very reason for existence is to actually promote Section 16A of the Constitution, because it's not only about creative freedom of creativity, but also about freedom of expression, the media, all aspects of research and academic freedom, which is what we do. For example, most of the works that you see on stage here, they're a product of that kind of scientific research, academic freedom, but also people to be free to innovate, to be free to aspire, to be free to think and create new ideas. So our reason for existence is exactly to do that, and we do that through, like I said, all the productions and other offerings that we do at the State Theatre.
As the Center for Creative Arts, we try to make sure that any of the artists that we engage in any of our productions for any of the festivals are treated with a great deal of dignity. We value human rights. We make sure that the working conditions for our artists through all our festivals is done in a place of dignity, and it's compliant to the university's rules, regulations, and policies. But that we are constantly aware that most artists work in a kind of freelance environment or gig environment where the conditions are sometimes very varied. What we try to do with our limited resources is to create a space that is always enabling for the artists and one that respects them completely as creators of work, as employees, and as partners to the projects that we work on.
Well, I think the most important thing for a theatre of our nature, because we aspire to be the national theatre of South Africa, and in doing so, we have to make sure that our policies and how we work with the theatre community or the arts community is in line with the constitution. So our policies are actually in compliant. For example, we make sure that all our policies protect not only the staff of the State Theatre, but our patrons, our artists, so everyone who is a stakeholder or is engaged in some creative work or business with the State Theatre, they are protected through our policy. For example, we've got policies, our general artistic policy, the policy on intellectual property protection, which is very important for the arts community, that we've got a policy that looks at production rights, policies on harassment, to make sure that all of us, when we are within the premises of the State Theatre, feel safe and also are able to create and innovate. But most importantly, when one looks at our mission and vision, especially our values as a State Theatre, our values actually they take or they derive from that section of the Constitution, because our values are about excellence, freedom of expression, accountability, which is crucial for us as an entity that looks after the welfare of the arts community in South Africa.
What human beings share as a common trait is that we tell stories, and we tell stories to our babies, and we tell stories to our children. And telling stories is how you learn.
I always used to say, aren't we lucky that the state provides us with such brilliant topics? Terrible things going on in the 80s and so on, but very, very good for theatre in a way, as perverse as that may sound. Well, now we have a really mad situation. If it's true that we are losing $1 billion a day to corruption at Eskom, that's terrible, but interesting topics.
So what inspires me to write is such a tough thing to sort of wrap my head around. I find inspiration in lots of different places. I think the main thing that I'm inspired to write by is knowing that there's very little out there for people like me, people like us, young people of color, young South Africans. The narratives of South African theatre have been very much about apartheid in the past. And that seems to be, when you go around the world, like I live in the UK now, whenever I talk about being from South Africa, people are always like, oh, wow, Nelson Mandela, apartheid. And I'm like, well, they don't say apartheid, they say apartheid. And I'm always just like, there's more to our country and our history and our legacy than Nelson Mandela and apartheid. And so the big part of why I write and why I make theatre is to offer more perspectives on South Africa, and to offer more perspectives on what it means to be a young South African, what it means to be a young South African in South Africa, around the world, what it means to be a young person of color, what it means to be, all these different identity intersections that I and my friends around me occupy.